Hey everybody, Mr. Summers here for American Government. Today we're going to be talking about the purposes and origins of government. So, jumping right in, here's your SWABOT. Students will be able to describe the features of a state, explain why governments were created, and categorize the functions of government. All right, so we're going to start off with our essential question as usual. Okay, what are the purposes of government? This is the question that we're going to answer by the time we are done with this lecture. What are the purposes of government? Okay, we'll start off with a scenario, okay? So a major storm with heavy winds has hit Woodlake, okay? That's our community. It has been over a week and there is still no electricity, no cell phones, no landlines, no water, no internet. Store shelves are all empty. Now you hear rumors that there are armed mobs roaming the town, killing families, stealing their food and supplies, taking over their houses, pillaging and plundering, and all kinds of horrible things. So you spend the next 4 nights sleepless, staying up, guarding your house from these mobs. I want you to right now on your notes page, go ahead and write down 2 adjectives that describe this scenario. Go ahead and pause the video here. Okay, what were your 2 adjectives? What did they describe? Did they describe how you're feeling? Did they describe what you're seeing in your mind? Did they describe things like fear, anger, frustration, anxiety, depression? Let's look at a couple of other questions here. How might you feel in this situation? If you were actually stuck in this situation, how might you feel? Would you be scared? Would you be amped up, ready to go? You're ready for this. You've been preparing your whole life for this. What kinds of people or groups would do well in this kind of situation? Would people who are passive do well? Would people who are aggressive do well? Who's going to do best actually in this situation? And how could the situation have been prevented? Not the storm, we can't prevent the storm, but how could the loss of utilities, electricity, communications, water, food off of the shelves, the mobs roaming the town killing people, how could those things have been prevented? Think about that. And as we're going through this lesson today, I want you to continue to think about these things. How could these things have been prevented? Who's going to do best in these situations? And how are you going to feel if you're stuck in a situation like this? We're going to start off talking about basically, the answer to those questions is government. Okay, government brings order and law to society. Okay, governments were essentially created to be the opposite of something called the state of nature. Two Enlightenment philosophers, Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, talked about the idea of the state of nature, and they had some similar and as well as some different ideas about this state of nature. Thomas Hobbes said that in this state of nature, all people lived in a state of fear. They lived in their life was very violent. It was short. It was brutish. They lived in constant fear of death, anxiety, but they had ultimate freedom. They could do whatever they wanted. If they saw something that somebody else had that they wanted, all they had to do was go and take it. If they didn't like anybody, they could kill them and nobody would do anything about it. They had ultimate freedom to do whatever they want. Pick any piece of land and live on it, hunt, make weapons, live whatever life they wanted to. No laws, no rules, no police. In other words, what we essentially call anarchy. Okay, so sounds kind of good, right? Well, Hobbes said eventually people would give up some of those freedoms, or gave up some of those freedoms to a leader who promised safety, security, and order. Once the people chose that leader, though, they were stuck with that leader and that style of government that leader created. If they didn't like it anymore, they would have to leave that society and go somewhere else and do something else. That was their only choice. Now, John Locke, on the other hand, pretty similar, described the state of nature similar. He said that, life was going to be violent and horrible, but he argued that people were generally good instead of generally evil and violent, like Hobbes said. Sorry, my classroom phone was ringing. John Locke also agreed that people had absolute freedom in a state of nature and that they would give up some of that freedom for order. But he said that the freedoms that they'd be willing to give up would be freedoms that wouldn't exist in a society anyway. Things like freedom to kill, freedom to steal, freedom to take advantage of others, those kinds of things, those wouldn't exist. Locke also agreed that in an organized society, the ruler would be chosen by the people, but the people could remove that leader if the leader did not protect the people's basic rights, which he defined as the freedom of life, liberty, and property ownership. Sound a little bit familiar? It should. All right, so here we get to the functions of government. What are the functions of government? Well, the scenario that we talked about earlier about the storm and everything was a description of an incidence of anarchy, a state without government or laws. Police aren't enforcing the laws, maybe because they're not around or whatever, but mobs running around, there's no communication, there's no order at all. Some people believe the government exists to prevent those kinds of things from happening by providing order and security to a society. And with that in mind, then the definition of government is any institution through which leaders exercise power to make and enforce laws affecting the people under its control. Okay, so that's the basic definition of government. But what does that really mean? It doesn't really tell us exactly what government does, so we got to look a little bit deeper. Okay, governments provide things like leadership, they maintain order, they provide public services, they provide national security, they provide economic security and assistance, they provide security and defense. Okay, so they exist to fulfill those functions. Governments make rules that everyone must follow and has the authority to punish those who don't follow those things. The system of laws creates social, economic, and personal benefits to those who live under the government. Okay, so as far as providing the leadership, okay, without leadership, no one or anyone can be in charge. That creates anarchy and chaos. So to prevent that, government establishes rules to say who can make and enforce the laws. They say what constitutes a crime and what the punishment for committing that crime is. They say who should pay taxes and how much they should pay, who can use the resources and how. And they also set the rules to say who can lead and who can't lead. In maintaining order, there's always going to be people who will disagree with each other, and there's going to be others who will take advantage of people. So government tries to control conflict and establish ways to resolve issues peacefully and fairly without having people take advantage of others, violence happening all over the place, and just crazy chaos and anarchy. So that's done through security forces like the police and National Guard who enforce laws and keep the peace. We've been seeing some examples of that this year. If you've been watching some of the Black Lives Matter riots and protests and things like that that have been going on, National Guard has been called in, police have been called in to assist with some of those things. And so you see that happening, trying to keep the peace. Governments can also provide courts and punish those who break laws. An effective government sets policies that allow people to plan for the future, to get an education, to raise a family, live orderly lives. Without government, that kind of civilized life just wouldn't be possible. It wouldn't happen. So government, a good, effective government allows people to live in peace enough that they can plan for the future. When humans were living in a state of nature, there was no future to plan for. You never knew how long you were going to live, much less where your next meal might be coming from. So governments created that order that would allow people to live in a more calm and safe environment and allow them to plan and create. I just realized if I move myself up here, I stay out of the way most of the way. Okay, Providing public services. Governments provide services that people cannot or would not do for themselves, like creating schools. They build sewers, they pave roads, they provide law enforcement, firefighters, all kinds of things like that. It could be public health, safety, housing and housing regulations, food production codes, so we don't get sick eating the food that's produced by our friends and neighbors, licensing guidelines and rules for operation of vehicles and performing certain jobs like being a doctor or a lawyer, things like that. Um, Fire department is funded by local government. That's a public service, okay, that is provided. Providing national security, pretty much a duh. We're talking about the military, whether it's inside, protecting inside the country, or providing protection from outside invasion. So this is enemies, as we say, both home and abroad. Um, Usually done through the military, but it's a pretty complicated task today. And in this day and age, we've got nuclear weapons, you've got spy satellites, you've got internet terrorists, you've got homegrown terrorists. So that's terrorists that are right here in our own country, Americans attacking Americans for whatever reason. You have international terrorists, people coming from outside of the country to create fear, and death and things like that. Um, all kinds of stuff that we have to provide security for. And it keeps changing and growing all the time. So that idea of providing national security keeps on changing. We have a new branch of the military apparently now, the Space Force. It is a real thing, I guess. Apparently, it's a real thing. I guess when I see Space Force recruiters on campus, I'll know a little bit better that that's really a real thing. But now I guess we're protecting ourselves from alien invasion. I don't know. Anyway, economic security, okay, allowing for people in our own country to be stable economically. Okay, that can mean regulating banks and other businesses to protect them from economic collapse, but it can also mean protecting the people from those businesses as well, especially things like the stock market and banks who might take advantage of people for their own profit. That provides security. The US also has been really big, being the main example, at providing economic security to others. So after World War II, the US spent millions of dollars um, with European nations, helping them rebuild their economies, their houses, their infrastructure through what was called the Marshall Plan. It prevented communist revolutions, giving us allies, and provided economic opportunities actually for Americans to go back to Europe or go to Europe and work. So Americans who had fought during the war came home, didn't have a job. Now they had a job, they could go back to help serve the people that they had just fought to defend and protect, and help them rebuild their homes. Economic assistance, 1930s and 40s during the Great Depression. We're talking about welfare systems and things like that to provide economic assistance to citizens. Unemployment protections, health insurance protections, things like that. Okay, that help keep Americans safe economically and provide for them in times of need. Okay, so shifting on to nation, state, and country. What's the difference? A lot of times we use those terms interchangeably. There is a little bit of a difference between the three of them. A nation is defined as a sizable group of people who believe themselves united by common bonds. It could be race, language, custom, history, religion, any kind of value systems. So a nation doesn't necessarily have to have boundaries. A nation could be just a group of people, okay? Just a group of people. They don't have to have boundaries. They just have to be a group of people united by something in common, okay? Now, a state, though, is defined as a political community that occupies a definite territory and has an organized government. A nation doesn't necessarily have to have an organized government or a defined territory, but a state does. Country is basically the same thing as a state. Um, Both of those, state and country, um, are what we call sovereign, or they have sovereignty. Sovereignty means that the government of that organization, so a state's government, is its own authority. There's no authority higher that can make any decisions for it. It doesn't have to go get approval from any other authority to do anything. The United States is sovereign. We don't have to ask anybody's permission to make the laws that we make. Canada, on the other hand, is not totally sovereign. They're semi-sovereign. They're actually part of the British Empire. So England, right? Okay, England. Certain laws that Canada makes, they have to get permission from England to do it. So they're not independent. Australia is in the same boat. So is New Zealand. They're all part of the British Empire. So Scotland, Ireland, all part of the British Empire. They are not completely sovereign. They're semi-sovereign. So they have another country that they have to go to get permission for certain things. Okay, so is a nation a state? Yes, it can be. Is a state a nation? Sometimes. Is a country a state? Yes, all the time. And is a country a nation? It can be. It can be a nation of countries or a country of nations, something like that. That's even more confusing. We'll move on. So where does state come from? Where does government come from? How did we get government? There's a lot of theories on that. Where did they come from? Where did they get these theories from? Well, by reading writings from philosophers, early government leaders, early scholars, from the Greeks and the Romans, those kinds of people. Basically, it comes down to this, okay? There are certain features that every state has. There's a population, there's territory, so established boundaries, government, okay, some sort of established law, order, with someone to rule over them. And then there's the sovereignty, okay? Population, territory, government, sovereignty. State has to have all those things, okay? How did they come about? One theory, evolution. It's called the evolutionary theory, okay? And no, it has nothing to do with Darwin, okay? But basically saying that government systems, cities, states, evolved from the family unit, okay? So you have mom and dad and their kids, and those kids get married and bring their families in, and then they have kids, and those kids get their families and bring them in, and you end up with this big extended family unit with either the mom or the dad, depending on the society, being the ruler. Now, if it's the dad being the ruler, the oldest male, that's called patriarchy. Patriarchy. Patri meaning father, archy meaning rule, father rule, okay? Some societies, though, had the oldest female was their leader. That's called a matriarchy. Matri meaning mother, archy meaning rule. So mother rule. There's the Force theory. No, again, doesn't have anything to do with Star Wars. Sorry. But this has to do with people being forced into a situation. Okay. So in this idea, this theory, states emerged when people needed to cooperate for survival. And so they were forced into this situation, kind of like the idea of safety in numbers, right? Ancient people grouped together to provide protection by building up walls, creating soldiers, hunters, farmers, all those different roles you need in a society. Some leaders that emerged from those times emerged and took control by force, by violence. They used violence to control the population. They used violence to get work done. They used violence to bring the group of people together to do the farming, the hunting, and all the building and all that kind of stuff, so that they could just sit back and not do a whole lot. Basically, when everyone in an area was united under one ruler, that's when a state was created. The divine right theory. Yes, this does have to do with God or the gods, whichever way you look at it, and depending on the society. So this theory says that a state was created when a leader was chosen by God or by the gods, depending on the society. This is a use of faith to control the people, to convince them of a ruler's right to rule by saying, I have been chosen by God to rule over you. So then if you argue with your ruler, you're arguing with God, and therefore you're not only breaking laws, but you're also breaking religious laws, making God your enemy, and your afterlife isn't going to be so great. So it's a way of psychological control over the people. This type of rule was found most commonly in the ancient Egyptians, ancient Chinese, the Mayans, the Aztec, and basically all of the European kings and queens, all the way up to present day. They still use that idea that they're chosen by God to rule. Okay, and nobody wants to disagree with the gods, right? Social contract theory. It's a little bit more of an Enlightenment era philosophy, but it's been applied to some ancient societies. Basically, the idea that people came together, they agreed to allow a ruler to rule over them if that ruler promised safety and order. Okay, Hobbes and Locke talked about these people. Basically, that's social contract theory. Okay. All right. So what should you take away from this lesson today? Well, first of all, the state of nature. Okay, Locke and Hobbes had similar views of the state of nature being a state of existence in which there's no law, absolute freedom. They also agreed that people would give up freedom in exchange for safety and order. But Hobbes thought people needed government because they were naturally evil and they needed someone to tell them how to be good. Okay, so once they chose their leader, they were stuck with that leader until they died, and that was it. Locke, though, thought that people were generally good and they would give up their freedoms for order and security. But he also argued that the role of the leader was to protect the basic rights of life, liberty, and property ownership. And that if that leader did not do that, then the people could replace that ruler. Okay, kill them, kick them out, remove them, banish them, whatever, and put in somebody else who would do those things. At the basis for the American Revolution. Here we are, back to our essential question. What are the purposes of government? Basically, governments are created to provide leadership, to maintain order and safety, and to create a stable economic system. What's the difference between a nation, a state, and a country? Well, we talked about it. A nation is just a group of people. Okay. I can't even think of an example right now of a group of people. But anyway, state and country basically mean the same thing. A political community that occupies certain territory with an organized government. They have sovereignty, which means no one else can make decisions for them. And basically, okay, reviewing the theories here. I'm not going to go over that again because I think we've done enough. And this is pretty much it. All right, guys. So go back and rewind any of this that you need to that you didn't catch. And we will talk again later.